Joe Adamson. There's a middle initial E, which stands for Ernest, and I was born June 4th, 1924, and in Königsberg, which is called Kaliningrad today, okay, in Germany, which is part of Eastern Germany. Oh, at home, they called me Joachim. That's what they called me.
And did you have a nickname?
A nickname, yes, it was Jochen, Jochen, which was a shortening of the word Joachim. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That was a nickname.
Your father's father had been involved in the government, right?
He was what you call, I would think that he was actually a councilman.
What was your father's full name?
His name was Paul. I don't remember his second name. His name was Paul. And my mother's name was Elizabeth. Her maiden name was Jacobi. The factory was in a building which he owned, and he finished the steel safes and sold them and shipped them to various parts. Being so young, I wasn't too familiar with the business, but I know that's where he was. My father, who died long before National Socialism came to power, but he was the proud owner of an Iron Cross, which is the Purple Heart, which they got. He took me on a sleigh. In those days, there was a lot of snow. In fact, we went to school by sleigh, in the winter, of course. And a number of times he took me to his factory where I played upstairs near his office. But that's a very vague memory, but I do remember that. And he was a very, very kind man, as far as I know, But as he died so young, and I was so young, the recollection is not too great about him. He had a heart attack in his office. It was instantly, In those days, heart attacks were not treated, and they couldn't be treated. There was no medication for this high blood pressure, and he died instantly in the factory, actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And my mother was left a very young widow at that time, very young. Mm-hmm. So she was born at the turn of the century, 18-something, 1890, but I'm not quite sure on that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And she lived a very comfortable life. We had a very beautiful home, and she had a nanny for me, and we lived a very carefree life, actually. My younger sister, her name is Susan. Her original name was Ilse Brigitte. And my other sister is Anne, which was Anna Marie. She's older. And we lived in as I say, a very nice house for a long time. And after my father died, then we moved a few years later into an apartment and lived there. She must have decided to move back to her parents' house because the funds had run out and there was a financial problem a few years after. So we moved to her parents' house, which was in Frankfurt Oder, which is different than that's a smaller town near Berlin. Yeah, so we moved there from Königsberg, which must have been around 1934 or 1935, somewhere around there. We moved there. Mm-hmm. Well, it changed. First of all, I moved to my grandfather's, my mother's father's house. He was fairly stern, he was a stern gentleman, very kind, but very stern. My grandfather was a lawyer, but he was a specialist lawyer, like in serving the justice system. So he was sitting on the bench, and we moved into this house and moved to the upstairs quarters of that house. Dinner was downstairs, which was always a very formal affair. People got dressed in those days for dinner, and there was a bell downstairs which summoned us to come downstairs immediately for dinner. And my grandfather still maintained servants, a cook and a chambermaid and who served. And I remember my grandmother sitting at the head of the table, and when she wanted something, she rang a bell, and just a little bell. And I went back to school, because I'd been to school in Königsberg, of course, and I went back to school in Frankfurt Oder. And I also joined a youth group. And it was after Hitler came to power already. But the Jewish population formed a group which was called actually I tell it to you in German, Bund Deutsch-Jüdischer Jugend. This was the young people of Germany. We had many trips by bicycle into different parts of the country with a tent, and we were still allowed to function. I remember one day I was chased by the children of the school, and we had these huge gates in front of our house with big knockers where you could knock to get in. And these children were chasing me, trying to beat me up. And frantically, I knocked on this door to be opened. And it was during the afternoon rest. My grandfather took a nap every afternoon before we went back to the court. And he opened the door, and what do you think happened? I got slapped in the face for waking him, first of all. He didn't ask any questions, what are you doing, you know? He was not religious at all, but he did belong to the synagogue, and the big occasion during the high holidays, he put on his top hat and marched into the first row of the synagogue. But I think that's the only time, because Christmas was celebrated with a Christmas tree. And we had a Christmas tree at home, and my mother was at the piano singing songs about. So the Jewish religion didn't really enter into this. So he was, as I say, very stern man. He believed in nothing could go wrong in Germany. You know, Germany above all was his country, and this would all go away after a while. You know, so but it didn't. Well, the first beginning was I had to leave school. I was supposed to go to a middle school, which is called a gymnasium in Germany. And they didn't accept me, despite all my grandfather's efforts to get me in there. They didn't accept any Jews. And there was no other Jewish institution in Frankfurt, being a small town, of where you could enroll as a student. So it was decided to send me to Berlin. And I went to a boarding school there. And that's where I ended up in, I think it was 35 or 36. I spent time in Berlin in the school. And so I left home, and I lived in a dorm, and there's lots of other students, and I went to a very strict school. But that's where I learned, it was a Jewish school, of course. That's where I learned about Judaism, or a little bit, and that's where I became bar mitzvah. And I learned to become a bar mitzvah, and which I had never known of before, you know. So as far as I remember, I liked it, you know. It wasn't like home, because you shared a huge dorm with other students, and everything was very controlled, you know, as far as where you could go, because it was already a difficult time for Jewish people in Berlin, but not quite as bad as it became later on, you know. So in the smaller towns, it was much more pronounced. Stores were marked as Jewish stores. People couldn't work anywhere, and they had to, of course, the servants had to let go, you know, you couldn't have any servants which are not Jewish. In Berlin, being such a big city, and I was more confined to an area where I didn't really notice it. Looking a little bit Italian in those days, you know, lots of Italians and other foreigners, nobody ever stopped me and said you can't go in because you're Jewish. We did enjoy that. And but basically most of the activities were within that boarding school, you know, our sports activities and going to a sports festival, which was strictly also a Jewish sports festival. So you were not allowed to mingle with any of the Hitler youth or whatever. You didn't want to mingle, but you wouldn't be accepted, you know. You had to stay on your own. You know, it wasn't that obvious to us that things were changing. Not until much later, when the Crystal Night started, you know. That's when things changed drastically. Crystal Night was a nightmare for the whole population. The synagogues burned, the stores were looted, the Jewish people were kneeling in the streets, scrubbing the streets, and were being sent to camps, and it happened actually overnight. And I was in school. The school was locked. You know, they kept us all inside. But our synagogue was absolutely plundered. There was a synagogue attached to it. And the German fire department made sure that nothing else burned around it. You know, they just protected the other buildings. So everything was plundered and burned. And I was told to go back home, and when I came home, it was unbelievable to see our house the chandelier smashed and the windows smashed, And my grandfather was really very benevolent to his neighbors, He invited the neighbors always for Christmas parties, and he was well respected by everybody. In those days they wore hats and everybody lifted their hat to say hello to him, but it all stopped suddenly, And so when I came back home, it was the first shock I really had. What can happen? Because the town was absolutely, the Jews all of a sudden disappeared, And my two uncles disappeared too. They were sent to Dachau, which was a concentration camp. But they both spent, I don't know how many days or even weeks there, not too long, because my grandfather, still being in office, believe it or not, was able to make a deal with the Germans that he would resign his position on the judicial committee or whatever if his sons could be released from concentration camp. And it worked. They both came out, and one of my uncles left for Paris because he had to get out of the country, having some communist affiliations, I think. And from there in Paris, he didn't stay long. He fled Paris too, and he went to the Foreign Legion. We didn't hear from him for years. He served in the Foreign Legion, which is like all the convicts did, And my other uncle soon after was able to leave the country and went to England and became a lawyer there, So that my grandfather accomplished. But after Kristallnacht, I came home, and the second day I was there, or the third day, my grandfather suffered a massive stroke, apparently, or a heart attack, one of the two. And he died that night. And again, the famous bell was rung downstairs to come down and see him. I was at his bedside actually when he died. So that's something which stays in your mind. I remember that. And so that was the end of that era for me. I was more or less. That was the end of the house. That was the end of everything. And I stayed there. Excuse me. I stayed there for a little while, and then went to England. I think I was more concerned is what am I going to do tomorrow, not what I'm going to do a year from now. I think as a child you don't think ahead that far. You think, what am I doing today, But I know that we were going to leave, But I didn't understand the idea that you immigrated, that you left the country. It never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that that I would be going somewhere, Not until about a week before I went. When I did leave, it was just another adventure. I left in January of '39. How did she present it to me? My mother had some connections in England. Apparently some people who ran a refugee organization. And she arranged for me to go on a children's transport, a Kindertransport. And how did she present it to me? That she said I was going to live with a different family, that I had to leave. And of course, I understood what was happening. I mean, I wasn't 4 years old, I was still 13. So you slowly understood what was happening. But it didn't occur to me as that I was in any danger. But it did happen continuously that children of my age were taken away, and they disappeared. They were taken to one of the camps. So it wasn't that I was going to be an exception and be kept alive. It was another adventure of like going to the school in Berlin, like going from Königsberg to Frankfurt. Here, my sisters and my mother took me to a train station, and I went to Hamburg. And they went on a ship all on my own, I think I was 24, 13 or 14 when I was really left home for good, I didn't realize I would never go back. It never occurred to me. But I'm sure all of us in those days were smart enough to realize that Germany would not be the place for us anymore,
When your mother was saying goodbye to you and your sisters were saying goodbye to you, do you think that they had any sense that they may not see you again?
My mother? Oh, I'm sure she did. She had no way of leaving, And my sisters were working on the idea of going over to England as domestics. That's one way you could get out, taking a position as a domestic worker. You had to have a job and a guarantee by somebody that you could come there to clean their homes. So they were working on that, you know, but they hadn't left yet. And they had to have training, so they went to domestic school, so to learn to be a domestic, basically, not being used to it. So I was actually the first one to go, because they figured that as a young boy I should leave first, you know. So, and they had the connections, and they managed to get me onto one of these children transports. So, but all you could take was a little suitcase, you know. It was a funny coincidence. My mother, having been in England once on a honeymoon, thought that the thing to wear were what the English wore during a golf game were the knickers, you know, the golfing pants which come up. That's what she bought me. And of course, that wasn't the case, but she thought this is the thing to wear in England. So I had a suitcase with one of those pairs and a pair of shoes, I think. But you're not allowed to take anything, because the examination before you went was very thorough by the German custom officials. You know, you couldn't take anything. I mean, if you were caught with something, you were put into prison immediately. So you couldn't take money. You could take 10 marks, and that's about all you could take. You know, I didn't speak a word of English. When I came to Southampton, I was met by a group of nuns who were doing charity and who heard about the transports. And I was put on a train, and two nuns accompanied me to Paddington Station in England. And I was told that from there I would be on my own. I was going to a place called Westgate, which is near Dover, on the west coast of England, on the east. And that I would be met there by a family whom I would live with. And that's the first time I think I felt very, very lost. Being all alone on that train, you know, and not speaking not a word of English. And it was a very strange experience. And I was met at the station by this new family, you know, who I didn't know until much later, who were being paid for taking care of me. They were not doing charity. They were being paid, I think, fairly good money to accommodate me, you know, and to take care of me. So I was met by them at the station with they had two sons, I believe, yeah. I was met by them. But they didn't understand a word of German, I didn't understand a word of English. So that was not a good situation, you know. But I learned it, I guess, like necessity, you learned it very fast. I went to school very soon after. Oh, the one English word I did know was, I read German books which was about an adventurer in the Arab countries and working for the British. And the people who carried the water and the luggage were called boys in Africa on the expedition. So I heard the father of the sons who I know I was going to live with said, "my boys." The word boy I understood. So that little suitcase I left standing, because I figured these were the boys who were going to carry my luggage. It turned out that was their son, you know, so I had to pick it up anyway myself. But that's the only word I spoke. They were just people to me, you know. They treated me also not as a member of the family. They treated me as somebody they're getting paid for, look after. It's like a foster child, you know. People get paid for that, you know. So, yeah.
So there wasn't much emotion there?
There was no emotion there at all, no, there was no emotion. And as I said, they taught me English, he taught me English, and he was a very strict father, apparently, with his children. And she was a nice woman, but it left no impression on me, you know. And they had a small house, and I had a room upstairs, but I really had no belongings. I didn't own anything, you know. I had my pair of special pants, which they changed, you know, and that was it, you know. There was no personal belongings, nothing which I could say, this is mine, you know. So.
How did you feel during that time?
I think I was very lost, you know. I was very lost. And then you slowly begin to realize that is going to be your new life somehow, you know. But you are still, I had no intention of changing. But Well, circumstances changed it for me very fast, But at that time, I went to school there, and but then the war started, and sooner or later Dunkirk came. We were very close to Dunkirk, and we had to move, and these people had to move too, and they took me along, of course, And we went to all different parts of England, lived on a farm, lived in small homes, but they left also because they figured, like everybody else, that the invasion was imminent, that the Germans would be landing any day now. So we moved into places like Devon and Somerset and different places. And that was also the end of my school days. Because why, I don't know, but I worked on a farm. I became a waiter in a local restaurant. I did many odd jobs, but why they didn't send me back to school, I don't really know. To this day, I do not know why, because I was still of school age. I had finished a certain amount of schooling, but they never sent me back to school. An enemy alien meant that you would help the Germans, or you help the Germans. And if you had a bicycle, you could possibly go to the coast and send signals to ships, or you could become a fifth columnist and blow up the next farmhouse or whatever. The fear of the Jewish refugees becoming a fifth columnist was the same fear as later on happened here with the Japanese. They were just interned, that's it, So I was not allowed to, as I say, ride a bike or never mind a car. So my transportation was a horse, and without a saddle, one of these farm horses. And I was caught one day by a constable. Constable is a British policeman. And he said, "You're not allowed to do this, young man." And I said, "I didn't know that." But he says, "You're going to be sent to the Isle of Man. You're going to go in front of a tribunal." Well, the tribunal consisted of the town, of the small farm town, of all the officials. Typical British officials sitting behind a long table. And I never forget that. Here I walked in, and they said, "Well, you were not allowed to do this. You're going to go to the Isle of Man, and you're not allowed to be in this part of the country. You're being an enemy alien." And I said, "Before you do that, I know my guardian." And my guardian happened to be a Colonel Layton, and also a Mr. Davis. And Colonel Layton was the commander of the Isle of Man, first of all, and also the commander of all the forces in Australia later on. A very British, well-to-do family. There's a book out about him, and I had never met him. But I knew that he was my guardian. And the family Himes got paid by them for taking care of me. And I told this gentleman behind the table, I said, "You should really contact Colonel Layton before you do this." And I remember the answer is this. He said, "Don't be cheeky, young man." Typical English expression. But they did contact him. And he sent a car for me. He apparently told him under no circumstances. And he sent a car down from London for me. And I went to his home, which was on the west end of London, a beautiful home. And I met him for the first time. He was a very nice gentleman. And that's where I learned that I had two guardians. One was this Mr. Davis, who ran a big dry cleaning chain in England. I do believe they still exist, I'm not sure though. And he was a prominent British, later on to be Lord Layton actually. And he had guaranteed a number of children, I guess. And he said, we got to do something with you, not to go back there. And we're going to send you to a special school to learn. You got to learn something, to learn a trade. And they enrolled me in ORT, which is in existence today, which is a training school for retraining people. And I went to Leeds, which was where ORT was functioning. And that's where I again went into a boarding school with all new friends and all new people, to learn to become a tool and die maker. And it was fun, because I was in England, but I still had no idea where the rest of my family was. My mother wrote to me, and the letters did come before the war, but after the war, then I learned that she had gotten to England. But she had lost contact with me too, because I was moving here, I was moving there, and the Himes family didn't keep in touch with her, you know, for some reason. Because I think they knew a good thing when they had one going, they were getting paid for this, you know, so why let go of me, you know. So at that point I had learned that my sister was already in London, working as a domestic. And my other sister had also, I believe, I don't recollect exactly the dates, I can tell you that, but they had both come there. My mother actually arrived, I think, 2 days either before or after the war started. She came out also with a domestic permit, but she also had to pay her way. I think she came through France, actually. That's how she got to England. I think it was through that organization that they found me, and she contacted me. She lived in a small town in Kidlington, outside Oxford, and she worked for a very nice family. They invited me to come up and to meet her, and I went there for a weekend. She was their housemaid, basically, you know, but that's the way it was, you know, and but they treated her quite well, I think, or decent, you know. And so I went for a weekend to see her there, you know, basically. And it was very nice. And I went back to Leeds from there, you know, went back to learn my trade, you know. It was a very strict school. You had to perform. I mean, it was well run, in my opinion. But after so many months, they wanted you out of there. They were ready for the next group, you know. So you had to learn fairly fast what you want to learn, you know. In looking back, our family was not as closely knit as I am today with my family. My mother was unhappy. My sisters had gone already their way as far as being a domestic, trying to save themselves, you know. There wasn't much of a family life to be picked up again, because we were really scattered already, leaving Königsberg, coming to Frankfurt. One sister didn't come along at all. My other sister went to Berlin right away. So I was the only one in Frankfurt, you know. So we were for a long time not living as a family, you know. So it wasn't such a close relationship. You're on your own. There's nobody going to tell you, you got to make a living, you got to do this, you got to survive, and there's really nobody whom you can fall back on, you know. So you grow up, you mature very fast, and you lose your childhood, actually. All the nice things that children do all their lives, you don't experience, you know. It's this whole generation of mine has lost their childhood, you know.
So what did you do after that?
I headed for London, because my sisters were in London. And my mother had left Oxford and went to London. And so I went to London. And we each lived in a boarding house, not together in one, each one had a room somewhere. And I went to work for the aircraft industry, because you had to do something, you had to do war work. You know, you had to enlist in something which helps the war effort. So I went to work for a company making parts for Lancaster bombers. And that's when I started really become a mechanic. At that time I'd moved together we found an apartment. We lived all in a boarding house, but we did find an apartment. And it was very small, but my sister moved in and I lived there. And at night I became an air raid warden, of course. And
can you explain what that is?
An air raid warden is you go through the streets with a helmet and make sure that all the windows are covered, that there's no light coming through, and if there's a bomb falling, that you try to help people, and you warn people of fires nearby. And the main thing is to make sure that nobody has opened the curtain, that there's no light whatsoever visible. There was no light in London, you know. The buses had covers on the lights, you know, and you couldn't, that was to deter the German bombers to find London. They found it anyway, but that was one way of deterring it. So it was continuous attacks with rockets, with bombs. In those days they were, as I say, flying bombs. You know, they had no pilots. They were sent pilots. Nobody knew how to handle that. When the engine stopped, you knew that the bomb was falling down. You know, So, but you did manage to, you went to a shelter, you took shelter in, as a matter of fact, I was on my way to work one day, and there was, they called it the Doodlebug. These were the bombers were called Doodlebug. And I was on my way to work in Richmond, outside London. And there was a warning that there were doodlebugs